The Volume Podcast.
Hi, my name is Liz Faber. I am the chair of the Arts and Sciences Division at Labouré College, which is a small healthcare college just outside of Boston. My research area focuses on representations of artificial intelligence in science fiction and computer history, mostly in the US, but I sometimes work with texts from the UK as well. Future projects, maybe you can have a more global perspective, but for the most part, I just focus on US history. I have a book coming out in this month, like 3 weeks away, called The Computer's Voice from Star Trek to Siri. It'll be out with University of Minnesota Press, and essentially the book looks at the history of how talking computers have been represented in science fiction from a gender and sexuality perspective. So when Siri came out in 2011, the default in the US, her voice was female. And so when she came out, I was like, wait, why? Why is this personal assistant automatically a woman here? That doesn't seem fair. And so I started looking at the history of not just of the development of the app, but also of how talking computers have been represented through film and television. And really, I discovered basically that it's along gender role lines. So we keep putting these computers into pre-existing gendered narratives. So, for example, the Star Trek computer was voiced by Majel Barrett, who is a woman and was the ex-wife of Gene Roddenberry, the producer of Star Trek, the creator of Star Trek. Whereas HAL 9000 in 2001: A Space Odyssey was this very menacing, terrifying computer and was gendered male. So there's a whole really wonderful and rich history of gendered narratives in science fiction, in looking at how talking computers construct gender in science fiction.
That's super interesting. We're going to go deeper into that, but tell me a little bit about like what's in you that drove you towards this study.
So a bunch of things. I'm a Star Trek nerd. That was really the biggest thing. I got really into Star Trek when I was in undergrad. And when I got to my PhD program, I realized like I was spending all of my time on science fiction anyway, and what I really wanted to do was study it. So I did my PhD in mass communication and media arts, and I got interested in sound design while I was there, and that just sort of fit naturally with my interests in science fiction. And at a certain point, I realized like I just want to dedicate my life to doing nerd stuff. And if I can try to make the world a little bit better and a little bit more aware of gender oppression and how things like gender and sexual orientation work and how we imagine them through science fiction, then that's totally a thing that I want to do with my life.
And explain to us a little bit more about like your work. So from, details to the big picture. And if you want to talk a little bit about your book as well, feel free.
For sure. So I do kind of a combination of textual analysis and historical research. I look at how science fiction, film, and television is situated in an historical moment and how those texts really dream up the present and the future for us. So, for example, Star Trek, the original series had these clunky, weird-looking computers, but they also had, like, effectively iPads in them. So, in the 1960s, they were taking what they had and looking towards the future. And that, to me, is really interesting, because computers, we use them all the time. I mean, we're communicating through a computer, right, and through the digital medium. But we have such a beautiful, rich history that we kind of tend to ignore because computers are so ingrained in our everyday lives. So getting to see that history through a cultural text, like a science fiction movie, I think is a really fascinating pursuit and is sort of the grounding of my work. At the same time, I'm working on a couple of other projects as well, all related to how the history of science fiction and the history of computers fit together. One of those projects is on how robots and artificial intelligence, how they die in science fiction, and how we understand the concept of death and spirituality through those texts. Because we talk about, oh, my laptop died. That means the battery ran out. But what if your laptop really died? What would that mean? And what would that mean spiritually for humans? And how would we interact with those? And there are a whole bunch of really wonderful science fiction examples of things like robots attaining enlightenment, or there's a really wonderful short story by Jack McDevitt called Gus, about a priest who becomes friends with a sentient computer, and by the end the computer kind of develops a soul. And so it's this really beautiful way of thinking about human interactions. So that's sort of one avenue that I'm working on right now. And then the other avenue is I'm looking at how healthcare and healthcare technology are represented in science fiction. So how have we dreamed of an ideal healthcare system, or how have we critiqued existing healthcare systems through our science fiction? So those are really the common strands in my research. Is I'm interested in how we think about technology and how we dream about technology and what that says about us and our relationships with one another.
I'm going to really try not to jump into something that you might answer in my next questions, because I have so many of them. So by doing it, by studying this, and by trying to understand and pointing out this cultural and historical facts from science fiction, how did that change your vision of the world?
That's a really good question. So when I started this research, I sort of assumed that computers were just objects. A lot of us look at them as like they're just things in our lives. But in fact, the way that we interact with technology is representative of who we are as people. So folks who are like screaming at Siri or Alexa, what does that say about them? What does that say about our natural impulses and how we interact with people? And so for me, I think that I'm much more intentional in how I think about technology, and how I think about the way that I interact with everything around me, not just people, but with computers and animals, and thinking about kind of how does it construct my identity through this to understand that I am putting myself in relationship with other things.
So there's this idea that by treating machines as machines, will we treat humans as machines, or are we already treating humans as machines?
Exactly. And science fiction has been asking that question for a really, really long time. We can go all the way back to Karl Čapek's play, R.U.R. from 1920, although there are strands of this earlier in science fiction, like in Frankenstein. But Čapek, in his play, essentially that story is about a capitalist who owns a company, and the company has created robots that do all human labor. And so humans don't have to work anymore. They can live a life of luxury and equality. But the trade-off is that robots are treated like slaves and treated as non-persons. And so throughout the story, by the end of it, one of the engineers kind of tweaks the formula for the robots, and they develop a soul, and they revolt. And spoiler alert, they murder all the humans. And so the whole idea of the play is that, first of all, in the present, if you treat other humans that way, of course they're going to revolt. That's the natural state of existence, right? And so it was very much a critique of the Soviet Revolution at the time, and some of the things that were happening in the 1920s. But we can also see it as a kind of morality tale of, if we are going to take it on ourselves to build things and interact with them like we interact with humans, we really need to be thinking clearly about how we're interacting with our objects, because it's a reflection of how we treat people. And the more that we accept treating objects as just objects, the more we start to accept treating people as objects. And there's some interesting research that backs this up too, some old research at this point. Clifford Noss was a researcher in human-computer interactions and cognitive psychology. And some of his research showed that even without physical presence, humans interact with computers mindlessly like they do with humans. And the same gender assumptions and sort of cultural norms that we use with humans, we apply to computers. And that's also true on the opposite. Like, that can be bad, but it can also be good at the same time. In the 1960s, Joseph Weizenbaum was a computer researcher, and he wrote a program called ELIZA that used Rogerian language processes. So a person could sit at a keyboard, and it wasn't a talking computer, but a person could sit at a keyboard, and the computer would ask, "How are you today?" And the person would say, "Well, I'm having a fight with my partner." And the computer would say, "Why are you having a fight with your partner?" And just sort of respond like that. And what Weizenbaum found, to his horror, was that people really felt like they were talking to a therapist. And they told this computer really personal details about their lives, not actually cognitively realizing that the researchers were reading every single thing they were writing because it was a research project. And so at the end of it, when the human subjects realized that Weizenbaum and his team were reading all of their personal secrets that they had told to Eliza, the therapy computer, they kind of freaked out. And they were like, wait, that's an invasion of privacy. And the sort of outcome of it was the realization that we don't treat computers as objects. We unconsciously treat our computers as people when we are asked to interact with them in that way. And that's extended to things like Siri and Alexa as well.
And how do you think this work and these studies, and I think we touched on this a bit, but how do you think this affects the life of the people that are listening to the podcast?
So in a bunch of different ways. Language is one big one. You mentioned your son has just learned to speak English and gets frustrated talking to Alexa. And those interactions happen between humans as well. And I think a big part of my work is thinking about how the English language in particular, but all languages, have limitations, and that we get frustrated culturally with those limitations. For example, when we talk about gender, something like Siri or Alexa, we've grown accustomed to describing them as she, even though they're objects. They don't have the bodies of a human, but we still ascribe gender to them that way. In English, we're starting to use they, them, which is great to indicate non-binary. But also, traditionally our options are he, she, or it. And a computer kind of exists somewhere outside of that when we ask it to, or ask him, or ask her, or ask them to take on the role of the other in our conversation. And we really need, as humans, to be able to identify with whoever the other is in order to be having that conversation. And when miscommunication happens, we get frustrated. So our computers can offer us ways of understanding communication strategies. The reason why your son gets so frustrated is that he's not being understood. And at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want people to understand what we're saying, and we want them to understand that the onus can't just be on the speaker. It has to be on the listener too. And we need to rethink the way that we even use language. How can we choose our words more carefully to be more inclusive? How can we choose our words to make the other person feel more comfortable? Or if we're trying to get them to be uncomfortable, how do we get them to do that as well? And as listeners, what is our job? Right? How do we be the good Alexa in that situation? How do we be the good listener and be able to respond to people's needs in ways that they will feel appreciated and validated? So those communicative values, I think, are one important thing that comes out of this. And I think the other thing is we should spend more time thinking about who we are and what narratives we tell about ourselves, because the narratives we tell about computers are the same narratives we tell about ourselves. And what does that say about us? I think that's the big takeaway, is we're not just creating machines. We're creating things that enrich our lives and augment our ability to interact with the world. And we need to be really careful about how we approach that technology.
Yeah, and the subject of self-awareness always comes up in this show. So it doesn't matter what we're talking about, self-awareness, self-knowledge is something that it's very important for us to survive and also to keep developing interesting machines and not being just used by the data or the machines. So we knew that we were prone to react to machines, especially if they have a couple of eyes. But I'm not sure if we knew that would be so easy to manipulate people online through a reaction machine. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is sort of the double-edged sword of technology, that we need to remember always who we're communicating with and how we're communicating. And the other side of that is that there's a programmer somewhere behind there that is making decisions that are leading to algorithms. So our media and our computers and our artificial intelligence, they're not unbiased little machines. And that's the other key aspect. When you talk to a human, you're talking to a human who exists in a culture and has that sort of transtextual understanding of the world. When you're talking to a computer, you are talking to a program that has been created by a person with a whole set of cultural assumptions and ideals, and that is a really important thing to keep in mind. Technology is never existing in a vacuum. In the same way that it's not just an object, it is never just a program. I don't know if you've read Safiya Noble's Algorithms of Oppression. I just finished that book, and her entire thesis is that Google is not unbiased, that the algorithm is tweakable, and that the often racist and sexist and ableist and homophobic search results that we get are not there because people like to see those results. They're there because Google is a company that sells ads based on clicks, and that the algorithm is much more complicated. And it's in Google's best interest to pretend that it's unbiased, to pretend that they can't tweak the algorithm, because keeping themselves out of it keeps them from any level of liability in how we perpetuate, in how Google search results perpetuate things like white supremacy. So that's another really important thing to remember in our interactions with technology, is that the tech itself is an illusion. It is, Siri is not a person. Siri is a cultural amalgamation of how we think of a person. She has a voice that has been programmed. She has responses that have been programmed by a person. And part of what makes her function as software is that we think of her as a person. And just like it's really easy to ignore the kind of seedy underbelly of culture, the white supremacist foundation of so much, particularly in the US, as an American historian, it's really easy to ignore that foundation and to just see the surface level. And that is also true with technology. So with humans and with technology, we need to look deeper, and we kind of need to look behind the curtain, as it were, at who is programming and what are the assumptions, and how do we uncover those assumptions and do better in our programming. it is both beautiful and powerful and also really terrifying at the same time. The example I always like to use when I talk to people about how algorithms work is, let's say that you and I are sitting here talking about how much we'd like to have a hammock, right? I want a hammock in my backyard. It's a little fabric thing that you can lay on and swing on. And doesn't that sound lovely? Well, at this moment, let's say that my cell phone, which is sitting in front of my face, has microphones enabled in most of my apps. It's listening, and it is hearing me talk about these things, and now it's going to use those algorithms. It's going to use that information that it's taken in and attach that to my account and start showing me advertisements for that specific thing. It's how the algorithm makes us feel like we're getting a personalized experience every time we're on the internet. And every single time I talk about this, I talk about how great hammocks are. We all really want a hammock. At least a handful of folks who've been listening will write to me and say, I saw ads for hammocks. Thanks a lot. You have messed up my algorithms now. And so it is both wonderful that we have technology that is easy to communicate with. You know, speaking is one of the most natural things in the world. Most of us develop it as children just by interacting with people. No matter what languages you speak or how many you speak, whatever your developed language is, that is a natural way of interacting with other people. And so being able to interact with a piece of technology through natural language processing is really powerful. However, all of it is corporatized. So that's kind of the bummer side of it, is that our data and our information is not just being stored in one person's head. Like when you interact with a person, it's being stored and collected and used for big data purposes, which is the very, very scary side of it. And often we're seeing it more in science fiction now that it's happening in real life. But often in science fiction, we didn't see as much of that. We saw other big scary concerns, things about the Cold War and our computers becoming sentient and destroying all of us. Now I think we are starting to wake up to the anxiety of when our computers are listening to us, what that actually means is that corporations are listening to us. Which sounds so tinfoil hat to say it that way. It sounds so paranoid, but it is in fact how algorithms work.
And going back to the subject of science fiction, there's this flow of dystopic and dreamy science fiction. I think it feels like there's a moment where the world goes all dystopic science fiction, and at some other moments it's all about dreamy and the future and how it should be or could be. So where do you think we are right now, and why that happens?
Absolutely. We go through cycles of this in science fiction, particularly in science fiction film and television. So the kind of golden age 1950s science fiction was very dreamy about space and very interested in exploration and what tech can we build that will make our lives better. And that was situated in the US in the post-war period. After World War II, when we were telling ourselves narratives about how amazing the US is and how our wonderful bomb technology won the war for us, even though we had actually done terrible, terrible war crimes, we were telling ourselves narratives about how we won the war and we are wonderful and technology will see us into the future. And so science fiction really reflected that in the 50s. In the 60s, as we moved into the Vietnam conflict and distrust in the government hit its height because, again, we were committing atrocities in other countries, science fiction really turned dark and turned towards the dystopic, and we were not exploring space in science fiction. We were having things like Colossus the Forbin Project, which is about a a computer that essentially becomes sentient and makes friends with a Russian computer and takes control of all the bombs and then takes over the world. And it is a terrifying comment not only on the Cold War, but on our distrust of government technology. And then other things like Soylent Green, right? These very sort of dystopian, terrifying, even 2001: A Space Odyssey that is about space is also very much about the destruction of man through technology. And so that late 1960s, early 1970s period was very dystopic. But then, in the mid-1970s, we had Star Wars. And that really changed everything. And the rise of the Hollywood blockbuster shifted us towards a sort of more utopic, happier vision. And then, of course, we had Star Trek Next Generation. And Star Trek itself has always been this utopian vision of a socialist future. And even though there is conflict in Star Trek, obviously, it is a happier vision of what the future and what technology can bring for us. And it is very attuned to ethical considerations of using technology. And I think that post 9/11, we sort of swung back a little bit. And we even saw this in Star Trek. Star Trek Enterprise is visually much darker than other Star Treks, and is a giant allegory for post 9/11 America. In sort of understanding terrorism and understanding addiction and all these sorts of xenophobic fears were expressing that anxiety that we had in post 9/11. And so I think in some ways we are shifting a little bit back towards a utopia, but we'll see where we go. I think we are far enough out of 9/11 now in the U.S. that we're starting to see new types of narratives, particularly from the newest generation's perspective. But we also have a deep distrust of our government, because the last 4 years have not created a sense of trust in our government in any way. So we shall see what the future of sci-fi is, but we move in cycles like that through it, and we consistently trust or don't trust technology based on really the geopolitics of America at any given moment.
And how do you see your work in 10 years' time? What do you think you're going to be writing about?
So I think for me, particularly right now in the pandemic, I think the pandemic is going to change everything. And for me, not just because I work for a healthcare college, but because health and healthcare is such a pressing issue in the U.S., I think that's the next big turn for me. I want to look at how science fiction has dreamt up a future for healthcare, and what that could mean for us, and how we've been envisioning good or bad futures for healthcare for many decades. In particular, how science fiction has helped us trace what we need from our healthcare system and the ethical problems in it. There are quite a lot of texts that are about sort of magical sci-fi surgery where like you wave a flashlight over somebody and they're healed. But there are also other texts that are about, a doctor going to a planet that is very much a capitalist planet, and the people who have the most get the medicine, and the people who have the least die in the streets. And so those sorts of narratives, I think, are really important to examine as well from a cultural, historical perspective. And in the U.S., this is a long-standing issue because our privatized insurance system is tied to employment, and we have rising employment due to the pandemic. So many people in the middle of a health crisis are without health insurance. And so something has to change. There has to be some sort of significant move towards public health care and understanding healthcare as a basic human right that has to be provided through taxes and through all of us contributing, because that is what citizens do. That's how you ensure a literally healthy country. And I am excited to see where we go with this in the US. I hope that one day there will be a time when we look back at science fiction and stories about corrupt healthcare systems and think, oh, look how quaint. Like we do with old sci-fi, where we look at all these old giant computers that take up a whole room and we're like, oh, that's cute. Look at that. Look at what things looked like in the past. And they were so worried about Russia. And I mean, we're still worried about Russia, but for like 5 seconds in the 90s, we weren't. And so we get to see those cycles and look back on the history and see how we've developed as people. And I hope one day we'll be able to look back at today's sci-fi and see the past as something that exists in the past.
Liz, thank you so much. It was awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
You know, I could talk to you for hours.
I could talk about science fiction forever, so.
The Volume Podcast. So if you enjoyed the episode and would like to get in touch with us or give us feedback, we are on Twitter at Volume Podcast. See ya. Thank you.